I shouldn't have been at that wedding, and if I had trusted that feeling, everything that followed would have never happened. The invitation had my name on it, printed in elegant gold script that felt too expensive for someone like me. Emily Carter, 26, single mom, still paying off hospital bills in monthly installments that never seemed to shrink. And yet there I was, sitting alone at a round table near the back of a ballroom that looked like it belonged in a movie, chandeliers dripping light like liquid gold, waiters gliding past with trays of champagne I couldn't pronounce, and everyone else dressed like they had. Nowhere better to be except exactly here. Except me, because I didn't belong. Not in a place where a single centerpiece probably cost more than my rent. Not in a room where people laughed too easily and touched each other like life had never been hard. I sat there smoothing the wrinkles in my navy dress, the one I bought on clearance 2 years ago, telling myself I would leave right after the cake was cut, right after I texted my babysitter to check on Lily, right after I stopped feeling like I might turn and realize I was out of place, but no one looked at me, and somehow that felt worse, like being invisible in a room full of light, like I could disappear and no one would notice. I checked my phone again. 8:17 p.m. Lily would be asleep by now, probably curled up with her stuffed rabbit, her soft breathing the only peaceful thing in my world, and for a second I thought about leaving, just quietly slipping out before anyone asked why I came alone, before anyone asked questions I didn't want to answer. But then I noticed something strange, a ripple in the room, subtle at first, like a shift in the air pressure before a storm, conversations lowering, laughter cutting short, people glancing toward the entrance without turning their heads fully, like they didn't want to be caught staring, and I followed their eyes without thinking. Just a quick look, just curiosity, and that's when the doors opened. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the cool night air to slip in along with him, and I didn't know his name yet, didn't know anything. Except that the room changed the second he stepped inside, tall, dressed in black like the rest of the world had agreed to fade around him. His presence quiet but heavy, like gravity had shifted in his direction. People moved without being told, creating a path that wasn't announced but understood, and I should have looked away, should have focused on my phone or the half-empty glass of water in front of me. But I didn't, I couldn't, because for one brief, impossible second, his eyes lifted and found mine across the room, and something in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, not yet, just a sharp awareness, like I had stepped into a moment that wasn't meant for me. And then I realized something else, something small but suddenly important, the empty seat beside me, the one I had taken without thinking, the one with a folded place card I hadn't read, and when I finally glanced down at it, my breath caught, because that seat wasn't empty by accident, it was reserved, and I had just made a mistake I didn't understand yet, but I was about to. I should have stood up the second I saw the name on that place card, but my body did not move, like something had quietly decided for me that it was already too late, and I could feel it now, the weight of attention shifting closer, not loud, not obvious, just a subtle tightening of the air around my table as footsteps approached across polished marble, measured and unhurried. The kind of pace that did not need to rush because everything else would wait. I kept my eyes on the card in front of me, the gold lettering suddenly too sharp to ignore. Moretti, the last name alone carrying a kind of gravity I did not understand but could feel in my chest. And then his shadow fell across the table before he did, long and precise under the chandelier light. And I knew without looking that he was there, standing just behind my chair, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. Close enough that every instinct I had told me to apologize, to stand, to explain that I had taken the wrong seat, that I would leave immediately, but the words stayed locked in my throat, and when I finally lifted my gaze, slowly, carefully, I met eyes that were darker than I expected, steady, unreadable, and entirely focused on me, not curious, not surprised, just certain, like he had already decided what this moment meant before I even understood it myself. I opened my mouth. I am so sorry. I did not realize this seat was taken. My voice came out softer than I intended, almost lost beneath the low hum of the room. But he heard it. I could tell by the slight tilt of his head, the smallest acknowledgement, and for a second I thought he would nod, maybe gesture for me to move, maybe dismiss me the way someone like him could dismiss someone like me without thinking twice. But he did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at me. And that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the people nearby to notice, long enough for the conversation at the surrounding tables to fade just a fraction. And then, without breaking eye contact, he reached out, not touching me, not quite, but placing his hand on the back of my chair, claiming the space without force, without urgency. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that did not need volume to be heard. "You are in my seat," he said, and I nodded quickly, relief flickering because this was normal, this was fixable. I could stand, I could leave, I could disappear back into the background where I belonged. "I will move," I said, already shifting forward. But then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Stay." And the word stopped me more effectively than any command could have. Simple, quiet, final. I froze halfway out of my chair, my heart picking up in a way that did not make sense for such a small moment, and I glanced around, expecting someone to laugh, to interrupt, to break whatever strange tension had settled over us. But no one did, because they were watching, not openly, not obviously, but enough that I could feel it. The awareness, the curiosity, the unspoken understanding that something was happening here, something I was not in control of. "I think there has been a mistake," I said, trying again, my fingers tightening around the edge of the tablecloth. "I am not supposed to be here." And that was the truth, the simplest version of it. But he studied me for another second, then pulled out the chair beside me, the one I now knew belonged to him, and sat down with the same calm precision he carried in every movement, as if nothing about this was unusual, as if I had not just taken his place, as if he had not just told me to stay. And when he turned slightly toward me, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear, he said, "You are exactly where you need to be." And something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable feeling that I had stepped into something I could not walk away from. Not anymore. The room did not return to normal after he sat down. It only pretended to. Conversations resumed, but softer. Laughter came back, but measured, like everyone was careful not to draw attention to something they already understood. And I sat there beside him, aware of every inch of space between us, aware of the way my hands rested too still in my lap, like any sudden movement might break whatever fragile balance I had stumbled into. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember that this was just a misunderstanding, something polite people would correct in a few seconds. But he did not correct it. He did not call over a server, did not ask anyone to switch seats. Instead, he reached for the glass of water in front of him, as if this had always been the plan, as if I had always been sitting here waiting for him. And that quiet certainty unsettled me more than anything else could have. I really should move. I tried again, softer this time, leaning slightly toward him so I would not draw attention. "I think you have me confused with someone else." And for the first time, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, just a subtle acknowledgement that he had heard me and chosen not to agree. "No," he said simply, his voice steady. "I do not." And the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just a calm statement of fact that left no room for argument. I looked down at the table again, searching for something normal to hold on to. The folded napkin, the polished silverware, the tiny flicker of the candle centerpiece. Anything that felt real and familiar, but even those things seemed distant now, like I was sitting inside a moment that did not belong to me. "You are making people look," I whispered, barely moving my lips. And that was true. I could feel it. The quiet attention from the surrounding tables, the curiosity, the unspoken questions. And for a second I thought that might matter to him, that he might want to avoid attention. But instead he leaned back slightly in his chair, completely at ease, completely unaffected, like attention was something he carried with him wherever he went, not something he needed to avoid. "They always look," he replied, almost absent-mindedly, like it was a detail too small to consider. And then his gaze shifted back to me, more focused now, more deliberate. "The question is whether you are going to leave." And the way he said it did not sound like permission. It sounded like a test, and I felt it immediately, that quiet pressure, not physical, not forceful, just the sense that whatever choice I made next would matter in a way I did not understand yet. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "I have a daughter," I said before I could stop myself. the words slipping out like they needed to anchor me to something real, something outside of this room, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in thought, like he was adjusting something in his mind, recalculating. How old? He asked, and the question caught me off guard, simple and direct. 4, I answered, my voice quieter now. She is at home with a sitter, and I do not know why I added that, why I felt the need to explain, but I did, and he listened, really listened, not interrupting, not dismissing. And then he nodded once, a small, decisive motion, as if that detail confirmed something for him, something I was not aware of, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough that it felt like the rest of the room disappeared. Then you will stay, he said, calm and certain, for one night. And my heart skipped, not from fear, not entirely, but from the realization that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a decision, his decision, and somehow, impossibly, I was already part of it. The word stayed with me longer than it should have. One night. Simple, contained, something that sounded temporary and harmless if you ignored the way he said it. Like it was already decided, like time itself had adjusted to fit his terms, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly against my lap as I tried to find something to hold on to, something logical, because none of this made sense. I cannot stay, I said, a little stronger this time, forcing my voice to carry just enough weight to feel real. I have to get back to my daughter. I only came here for a few hours, and that was the truth, the only truth I trusted in that moment. But he did not react the way I expected. No frustration, no insistence, just a quiet pause as he looked at me again, not past me, not through me, directly at me, like he was measuring something deeper than my words. And then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, slow, deliberate, pulling out a phone that looked like it belonged in a different world than mine, sleek, understated, expensive without needing to prove it. He tapped the screen once, then twice, and held it for a second before lowering it again. Your sitter's name is Claire, he said, not asking, stating, and my breath caught so suddenly it felt like I had missed a step on a staircase. How do you know that? I whispered, the words barely forming as my heart picked up in a way that was no longer just unease. It was awareness, sharp and immediate, and he did not answer. Right away, he did not rush to explain. He simply placed the phone face down on the table, his gaze never leaving mine. She has already been told you will be late, he continued calmly, and she has been compensated for the extra time. And I stared at him, unable to process the way my world had just shifted without my permission. Claire would not accept that from a stranger. She would call me first. She always called me first. Unless she had been told something that made her feel safe enough not to, and that thought settled in my chest with a weight I could not ignore. You had no right, I said, but the words lacked the force I wanted them to have, because part of me already knew that rights were not something he operated on, not in the way I understood them, and for the first time, something in his expression softened, not kindness exactly, but something quieter, more controlled. You are not being kept here, he said, his voice lower now, more personal. You are being kept safe. And that word landed differently. Safe, not owned, not forced, safe. And I did not know whether to believe it or question it, because nothing about this felt safe. Not the way he watched the room without turning his head, not the way people avoided looking directly at our table, not the way the space around him felt carefully maintained, like an invisible line no one dared cross. And I followed his gaze without meaning to, noticing for the first time the subtle movements around the edges of the ballroom. Men in dark suits positioned near exits, not obvious security, but something more deliberate, more aware, and then I saw it. A man near the far column, standing just still enough to stand out, his attention fixed not on the bride or the dance floor, but in our direction, in my direction, and a chill moved through me, quiet but undeniable, because I knew that kind of attention did not come from nowhere, and when I looked back at him, really looked this time, I saw the difference, not just power, not just control, but intention, like he had stepped into this moment for a reason that had nothing to do with coincidence. You walked into the wrong seat, he said softly, almost like he was explaining something simple, something inevitable, and now you are visible to the wrong people. And my pulse jumped, the room suddenly feeling too bright, too open, Too exposed. What does that mean? I asked, my voice unsteady. Despite everything I was trying to hold together, and he held my gaze for one more second before answering. Calm, certain, leaving no space for doubt. It means you stay with me, he said, or you leave alone. And the way he said the second option made it clear it was not really an option at all. For a second I thought about standing up anyway, about ignoring everything he had just said and walking out like none of this mattered, like I could still choose normal over whatever this was. But my body did not move, because now I could see it too. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand that something had shifted the moment I sat in this chair. The man by the column was not pretending anymore, his attention too focused, too steady, and when our eyes almost met he looked away. Just a fraction too late, like he had been watching me long before I noticed him. And a quiet unease settled deeper into my chest, the kind that does not come from imagination but from instinct, the kind you learn to trust when you are responsible for someone else's safety. And suddenly this was no longer about a stranger telling me to stay. It was about whether leaving would make things worse. You are saying I am in danger, I said, my voice low but steady, forcing the words to come out clearly, and he did not rush to answer. He did not dramatize it. He simply nodded once, small and controlled, like it was a fact too simple to argue. You are saying that because I sat here. I continued, trying to understand it, trying to make it logical. Someone thinks I am. I hesitated, because the word felt too strange to say out loud, too unreal for the life I lived. But he finished it for me without hesitation. Mine, he said, and the word landed heavier than before. Not a claim, not a threat, but a position, a label that now existed whether I accepted it or not. And I felt my breath catch again, because that meant something to the people watching, something I did not fully understand. I did not agree to that. I said quickly, the words coming out sharper now, because this part one could fight, this part one could refuse, but he did not argue. He did not need to. You did not have to, he replied calm, almost patient, like he had seen this reaction before. They only need to believe it. And I looked back toward the room again, really seeing it now. The way certain people kept their distance, the way the staff moved around this table with careful precision, the way no one interrupted, no one questioned, and suddenly it made sense in a way that made my stomach tighten, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough to know that perception here mattered more than truth, enough to know that walking away would not erase what had already been seen. So what happens if I leave? I asked quietly, and this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly past me, scanning something I could not see, calculating in a way that felt precise and controlled. And when he looked back at me, there was something different in his expression, not softer, not colder, just more direct. Then you walk out alone, he said, his voice even, and they will follow the version of you they believe exists. And I did not need him to explain what that meant, not fully, not in detail, because my mind filled in the spaces on its own, not with images, not with anything dramatic, just with the quiet understanding that being mistaken for something valuable in the wrong place could change everything. And my thoughts went immediately to Lily, to her small hands, her quiet voice when she asked if I would be home soon, and the idea of something following me out of this room, out into the normal world I had fought so hard to build, made my chest tighten in a way that was no longer just fear, it was decision, slow and reluctant, but unavoidable. I turned back to him, meeting his eyes again, really meeting them this time. And for the first time I did not see just control, I saw expectation, like he already knew what I would choose. And maybe that was what frustrated me the most, that he was right, because I exhaled slowly, my shoulders lowering just enough to signal something had shifted. One night, I said, the words careful, deliberate, like I was setting a boundary I needed to believe in. I stay for one night. And he held my gaze for a second longer before giving a small nod, not victory, not satisfaction, just confirmation, like a decision had finally aligned with something he had already planned. And as he leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension around the table eased just enough for the room to breathe again. I realized something that made my pulse steady in a different way. I had not been forced to stay, not exactly, but somehow, that did not make the choice feel like mine at all. The moment I said it, something shifted in the air around us, subtle but undeniable, like a quiet agreement had been signed without paper, without witnesses, and yet everyone somehow knew, because the tension that had been pressing in from the edges of the room loosened just enough to breathe again. Not gone, just redirected, and I felt it immediately, the way attention moved away from me. Not completely, but enough that I was no longer the center of it. And that alone told me I had made the choice he expected, the choice that aligned me with him in a way that could not be undone by simply standing up and walking away later. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, trying to remind my body that I was still in control of something, anything. But it was difficult when everything around me felt carefully arranged, like pieces on a board I had accidentally stepped onto. What happens now? I asked quietly, because I needed something concrete, something I could understand, and he did not hesitate, did not look surprised by the question. Now, he said, his tone even. You stay close. And it sounded simple, almost harmless, but there was something beneath it, an unspoken layer that made the words feel heavier than they should have been. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because there was nothing else to do, no better option I could see from where I was sitting, and for a moment, things almost returned to normal, or at least something that resembled it. A server approached the table with careful precision, placing a fresh glass of water in front of me without meeting my eyes, as if acknowledging me too directly would break some invisible rule. And I noticed it then, the way everyone interacted differently here, not fearful exactly, but aware, controlled, like every movement had been practiced to avoid mistakes. I reached for the glass, my fingers brushing the cool surface just to ground myself in something real, something ordinary. And when I took a small sip, I realized how dry my throat had become, how long I had been holding tension without noticing. You should eat something, he said suddenly, his gaze shifting briefly to the untouched plate in front of me. And I almost laughed at the normality of it, at how absurd it felt to be told to eat in the middle of whatever this situation was. But there was no humor in his voice, just quiet expectation, and I glanced down at the food, elegant and carefully arranged, something I could not name, something I would not normally order. And for a second I hesitated, not because I did not want to eat, but because the act itself felt like acceptance, like participating in something I still did not fully understand. But then I picked up the fork anyway, because refusing would not change anything, and taking control of even the smallest action felt necessary. I took a bite, slow and deliberate, focusing on the taste, the texture, anything that reminded me I was still myself, still Emily, still someone who had a life outside of this room. And as I did, I noticed him watching me again, not intensely, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, just observing, like he was confirming something internal that I could not see. You are handling this better than most would, he said after a moment. And I did not know how to respond to that, because I did not feel like I was handling anything. I felt like I was reacting, adapting, trying to keep up with something moving too fast for me to fully grasp. I do not have a choice, I replied quietly. And this time, something in his expression shifted again, just slightly, like he recognized the truth in that more than anything else I had said so far. And he nodded once, almost to himself. There is always a choice, he said, but not all choices lead to the same outcome. And I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to understand the man behind the control, behind the calm certainty. And for the first time, I wondered not just what he wanted from me, but why he had chosen me at all, because this was no longer about a seat, or a mistake, or even one night. This was something else entirely, something I had not seen coming, and now I was already inside it. It should have felt easier after that, after making the decision to stay, but it did not. It only changed the way the tension sat in my chest, less sharp but heavier, like something I had agreed to carry without fully understanding the weight of it. And I tried to focus on small things again, the rhythm of the music drifting from the dance floor, the soft clink of glasses, the quiet hum of conversations that had slowly returned to life. But now everything sounded different, distant, like I was listening from behind glass, because part of my attention stayed locked on him, on the way he moved without urgency, on the way his presence seemed to shape the space around him without effort. And I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. He was not reacting to the situation. He had already anticipated it, already stepped into it with a purpose I could not see yet. Why me? I asked finally. the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it had been building in the back of my mind since the moment he told me to stay. And this time he did not answer right away. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting past the room again, scanning, calculating, and I followed his line of sight without meaning to, noticing movement near the far side of the ballroom. The man by the column was no longer alone. Another figure had joined him, their posture casual, but their attention too precise, too aligned. And something about that made my stomach tighten again, because this was not random. This was not coincidence. And when I looked back at him, I knew he had seen it too. Because you were the only variable they did not account for, he said quietly, and the words settled in a way that felt both confusing and unsettling. I do not understand, I admitted, my voice lower now, more careful, and he nodded slightly, as if he expected that. They expected someone else to be sitting here. He continued, his tone measured. Someone connected to me, someone they could approach without raising suspicion. And I felt the pieces start to shift in my mind. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to form a shape. Enough to understand that this seat, this position, carried meaning I had never intended to take on. But instead, he added, his gaze returning to me, steady and direct, they found you. And there was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten again. Not fear this time, not exactly, but awareness. Like I had stepped into a role without auditioning for it, and now the audience was watching to see how I would perform. So I am a mistake, I said, trying to simplify it, trying to make it something I could process, but he shook his head once, slow and deliberate. No, he said, you are a complication. And that word felt different, heavier, more deliberate, like it carried weight beyond this moment. And I did not know whether that made things better or worse. And complications need to be managed, I replied, the logic forming before I could stop it. And for the first time, something like approval flickered in his expression, subtle but there. Exactly, he said, and the calm certainty in his voice told me that this had never been about chance. Not entirely. He had seen an opening and taken it, turned a mistake into something controlled, something contained, and I was part of that now, whether I wanted to be or not. I glanced toward the edge of the room again, noticing that the two men were no longer standing still, their positions shifting slightly, their attention still anchored in our direction even when they pretended otherwise, and a quiet realization settled in my chest. This night was not going to pass quietly, not without something happening, not without something changing. And when I turned back to him, I noticed the way his posture had adjusted, barely noticeable, but ready, aware, like he was waiting for something I could not see yet. Stay close, he said again, softer this time, more like a reminder than a command, and I nodded without thinking. Because now I understood at least one thing clearly. This was no longer about leaving early or staying late. This was about getting through the night in one piece, and somehow, impossibly, the safest place in that entire room was right beside the man who had claimed me without asking. The music shifted into something slower, softer, the kind that pulled people toward the dance floor without needing an announcement, and I watched as couples stood, hands finding each other with practiced ease, laughter returning in a way that almost made the room feel normal again. Almost, because the edges of my awareness stayed sharp, anchored to the quiet movements I had started to notice. The subtle repositioning of people who were not really guests, the way certain lines of sight kept returning to this table no matter how casually they tried to disguise it. And I felt it again, that pressure, not from him this time, but from the space around us, like the night was building towards something I could not see yet. Do not look at them, he said quietly, not turning his head, not breaking the calm rhythm of the moment, and I realized too late that I had already done exactly that, my gaze flicking once more toward the far side of the room, where the two men now stood closer to the dance floor, blending in better, but still watching, always watching. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the flicker of candlelight between us, on the steady line of his hand resting near the edge of the table, relaxed but ready, like stillness was a choice, not a default. They are getting closer, I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips, and for a second I wondered if I was imagining it, if this was all just tension turning into something bigger in my head. But he did not dismiss it. He did not tell me to calm down. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that confirmed everything I did not want to believe. Yes, he said, calm as ever, because they think you matter. And that sentence changed something inside me, because it was not about me, not really. It was about what they believed I was, what they thought I represented sitting here beside him, and I felt my pulse steady in a strange way, not slowing, but sharpening, like my body was adjusting to the reality of the situation whether I wanted it to or not. What do? I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice. No uncertainty, just the need for direction, for something clear in the middle of all this. And he turned his head slightly, just enough for his gaze to meet mine again, steady and focused. You stay with me. He repeated, softer now, but more deliberate, like the meaning had deepened since the first time he said it. And then, after a brief pause, he added, and when I stand, you stand. And it sounded simple, almost too simple, but I understood immediately that it was not about the action itself. It was about timing, about control, about moving in a way that kept everything aligned with his plan, and I nodded once, because there was nothing else to do, no better strategy one could come up with on my own. And for a moment, everything seemed to slow, the music, the movement, even the air, like the room was holding its breath without realizing it. And then he moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, deliberate shift as he stood from his chair, and I followed a half-second later, my body reacting before my mind could question it. And suddenly we were part of the flow of the room, not sitting, not still, but moving, and I felt it immediately, the change in perspective. The way standing beside him made everything else feel slightly further away, slightly less overwhelming. And as we stepped toward the edge of the dance floor, I noticed the two men again, their posture adjusting, their attention sharpening, and something inside me settled into place. Not comfort, not safety exactly, but clarity, because I finally understood the shape of this night. It was not about avoiding attention anymore. It was about controlling it, and for reasons I still could not fully explain, the only person in that entire room who seemed capable of doing that was the man I had never intended to sit beside in the first place. The moment we stepped onto the edge of the dance floor, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call attention to it, but I felt it in the way conversations dipped just slightly, in the way people shifted their positions to create space without making it obvious, and I realized this was not just movement, this was signaling, controlled and deliberate, and I stayed close to him like he had instructed, close enough to feel the steadiness in the way he carried himself, the absence of hesitation in every step, and it grounded me more than I expected, not because I trusted him completely, but because he seemed to understand this world in a way I clearly did not, and right now that mattered more than anything else. Do not react, he said quietly as we slowed near the center of the floor, his voice low enough that only I could hear it, and I nodded once, even though I did not yet know what I was not supposed to react to. But then I saw it, not directly, not at first, just a shift in the space behind him, a movement that did not match the rhythm of the music, and when I glanced past his shoulder, carefully, like I had learned to do over the last few minutes, I saw one of the men approaching, not fast, not aggressively, just walking with purpose, like he had every right to be there, and my pulse jumped, but I kept my expression still, forcing my breathing to stay even, remembering his words, do not react. Because reacting would mean acknowledging something that was not meant to be acknowledged. And that was when I understood, this was not about stopping anything. This was about controlling how it appeared, controlling what everyone else believed was happening. And as the man came closer, stopping just within speaking distance, I felt the tension tighten again, not around the room this time, but within the space we occupied, contained and focused. Mr. Moretti, the man said, his tone polite, almost casual, like this was a normal interaction at a normal event, but there was something underneath it, something measured and intentional, and I kept my gaze forward, not looking directly at him, just aware of his presence at the edge of my vision. You did not mention you would be attending, he continued, and there was a slight pause, like he was waiting for something more, something specific, and I realized that something was me, the unexpected detail, the complication, and for a second I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, what version of me existed in his mind. But before I could think any further, I felt it, The lightest pressure at my lower back, not forceful, just enough to guide me half a step closer to him. And the gesture was so subtle, so controlled, that no one else would question it. But it changed everything. Because now there was no distance between us, no space left for interpretation. I did not plan to, he replied calmly, his voice steady, unaffected, but plans change. And the way he said it made it sound final, like the conversation was already over even. Though it had just begun, and there was a brief silence, a moment where the man seemed to reassess, to adjust his expectations based on what he was seeing, and I could feel it, the shift in attention, the recalculation, and then his gaze moved to me, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge my presence, and I held still, not looking back, not reacting, just existing within the role that had been placed on me, and after a second, he nodded slightly, as if accepting something unspoken. Of course, he said, stepping back just enough to create space again. Enjoy your evening. And then he turned and walked away, blending back into the room as if nothing had happened, as if this entire moment had been ordinary, expected, and I exhaled slowly, not realizing until then that I had been holding my breath. And when I looked up at him, really looked this time, I saw something different, not tension, not concern, just quiet confirmation, like something had gone exactly the way he intended, and that was when it truly settled in, not as fear, not even as uncertainty, but as a realization that would stay with me long after that night ended. I had not just been sitting in the wrong seat. I had stepped into the right place at the exact moment someone like him needed me to be there, and whether I understood it or not, whether I wanted it or not, that single decision had already changed the direction of my life in a way I could not undo.